the personality of the man who's running the show is immensely important. It's the key factor, in every African country I've ever covered as a journalist or as a writer. I think you're seeing that in America, where it seems that despite all these famous checks and balances that we all heard about for decades and decades, the whims of Trump are really changing everything.
This is the Rhyming Chaos podcast, where we interview people who have lived through or studied times of great upheaval or authoritarian takeover. We hope these interviews can help us understand what is happening in the United States right now and how decent people can fight against it. I'm Jeremy Goldkorn. My Jewish Latvian grandparents immigrated to South Africa before World War II, and I grew up in the apartheid era just down the road from Elon Musk. I lived in China for 20 years, and I've been living in Nashville, Tennessee, in the American South since 2015, and watching the country gradually become more and more repressive. I'm hosting solo today. Maria Repnikova will be back next week. I am delighted today to welcome a writer whose work I've been reading for many, many years, Michela Wrong. Half Italian, half British, Michela joined Reuters in the early 1980s and was posted as a foreign correspondent to Italy, France, and Ivory Coast. In 1994, she moved to what was then called Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where she covered the final days of Zairean dictator Mobutu Sese Seko and the genocide in the neighboring country of Rwanda. She subsequently reported from and on much of the African continent for the Financial Times. She's published a number of books, including In the Footsteps of Kurtz, The Story of Mobutu's Rise and Fall, which won a PEN Prize for nonfiction. I Didn't Do It For You, a history of the sad country of Eritrea, the Red Sea nation that is a little like Africa's North Korea. It's Our Turn to Eat, about the Kenyan corruption whistleblower John Githongo, a novel called Borderlines, which is a legal thriller set in the Horn of Africa, and the book that will make up much of our discussion today, Do Not Disturb, which was published in 2021. These books have brought Michela a number of awards and also a PhD. So, Dr. Wrong, or if I may, Michela, welcome to Rhyming Chaos.
Thank you. Yes, I was very pleased to get my PhD, and then I immediately forgot all about it. I now completely forget to mention it, but it's nice that you noticed.
I think that's the proper attitude anyway. Before we get into the book, let me try to very briefly summarize the complicated history of the two tiny countries of Rwanda and Burundi, which people often forget about. Jammed between Uganda, Tanzania, and the Congo, these countries were governed by different monarchies before the colonial period. That, I believe, is why they remained separate countries under colonial rule, which began with the Germans from 1897 until World War I. So around 1916, 1917, Belgium took over Rwanda and Burundi until their independence in 1962. And both colonial powers used a divide and rule strategy over the indigenous inhabitants, composed mostly of two ethnic groups, the Hutus and the Tutsis. Is that about right, Michela? And can you explain why the two countries, Rwanda and Burundi, seem to have had such different histories in recent decades? I traveled in both for several weeks in 1991, and they seemed so similar.
I think it always boiled down to who was in control of the security forces. And really, both countries, their journeys have been dictated by the fact that there's a Hutu majority and a Tutsi minority. And so I think both countries' trajectories were dictated by whoever was running the army of the day. And both countries have had an enormously violent history and continue to be very unstable and prone to violence. I always look at them and I think genocide is something you learn. Burundi has had a genocide. You won't notice anyone ever talking about it. Everyone is always very well aware of Rwanda's genocide for all sorts of historical reasons. But Burundi has had its own genocide, which passed largely unnoticed by the outside world.
Also, perhaps unnoticed by much of the outside world, is your challenge to the conventional narrative about the Rwandan genocide. So Do Not Disturb is in some ways mostly about the years after the Rwandan genocide, but it's also a critical look at the popular narrative of the genocide, which is promoted by the ruling government of President Paul Kagame and still widely believed outside of Rwanda. Do Not Disturb questions who shot down the plane of the previous Hutu president of Rwanda, Habyarimana. He was president from 1973 until his assassination in 1994, which really is usually attributed as the cause of the Rwandan genocide by Hutu people of Tutsis. Your book suggests it may actually have been the Rwandan Patriotic Front, the party of current President Paul Kagame, rather than Hutu extremists who shot down the plane. This is really quite explosive. What evidence supports this claim, and why do you think it hasn't been more widely discussed and accepted?
Well, it's explosive, but it's not new. And I'm very much not the first person to say this. And I have to say that when I started writing the book, I wasn't convinced. I remember first seeing these claims being made in The Guardian, actually, where former members of the RPF, the Rwandan Patriotic Front, were giving interviews and were saying, actually, it's not the Hutu extremists, as everyone had been told to believe, who brought down the plane. It was the Rwandan Patriotic Front. And that they decided to take out Juvenal Habyarimana as he was returning from peace talks in Tanzania because they wanted a swift end to the war, and inadvertently in the process triggered the genocide because, of course, the murder of Habyarimana was used by the Hutu extremists in the army and the Interahamwe, the militias, as the pretext and the reason that the Tutsis needed to be eliminated. The president had been assassinated. So I remember seeing it in the pages of The Guardian. I remember being very skeptical. I didn't believe it. And then there were just more and more of these stories circulating. There was a very famous book written by a former RPF military officer who had gone into exile and gave a lot of details about the shooting down of the plane, saying the Rwandan Patriotic Front did it. He then rescinded what he had said in the book and then annoyingly rescinded his rescindment, whatever the phrase is. And I think this is something that, I try and describe in my book, that you're constantly confronted with Rwandan history with people who tell you one thing and then the same people a couple of years down the line tell you the complete opposite and say, well, I never expected you to believe me the first time. And it's one of the reasons that almost every episode in Rwandan history is so contested. But for me, the change came about because while I was researching the book, and it was always clear in my mind that that wasn't going to be the main focus of my book, I sort of thought, I don't know the answer to that, and I'm not going to go there because that's not what my book is about. I found I was doing a lot of interviewing of people who'd been very high up in the RPF, who were now in exile, who were now regarded as enemies of the state and had very, leading roles. And they were all saying, yeah, we did it. Of course we did it. It's always been obvious that we did it. Why would anyone not believe that? And that made me sort of do a double take. And I then totted up the number of people who were high up in the RPF who had said that to me. And I also read there is a lot of forensic study has been done into where the missiles were probably fired, where they came from, what the ballistics showed. And I ended up just thinking, if you don't believe the people who were there at the time, who were within the movement at the time, and who, to a certain extent, have nothing to gain from saying this, because by admitting it, they are publicly acknowledging that they're accessories to crime. If you don't believe them, who are you going to believe? And one of the key things for me, there's so many elements that led to me changing my mind on this, but one of the key things is that traditionally the perpetrators were allegedly the Hutu extremists who had decided that Habyarimana had sold them out during the Arusha peace talks, had conceded far too much to the RPF, and who also wanted an excuse to launch the genocide. So that's the theory. And what I've noticed is that over the years, that group of people have never claimed responsibility for the murder of Habyarimana and for the downing of the plane. Whereas the RPF, the key members of it, have repeatedly, publicly claimed responsibility. And yet in the West, there's this great tendency to believe that the Hutu extremists who never admitted responsibility and never claimed it were responsible, while ignoring and sort of saying, they're just embittered, marginalized, alienated people, ignoring what they have to say. So it just seemed to me counterintuitive. But there are other elements, but I'm not going to go into them here. I think we've probably spent enough time on it already.
It's complicated enough. Aside from, as you've just pointed out and write in your book, the Rwandan tendency to be very generous with the truth, there is also, it's an extraordinarily complicated story. Just keeping all the players straight in my mind is very difficult.
Yes. Yes.
And all happening in this tiny little country.
Yes. And there's been, inquiry after inquiry. There have been inquiries in Belgium. There have been inquiries in France because the crew who were aboard that jet when it came down were French. There have been inquiries in Rwanda, and, they've all come to different findings. So it's a very, very murky episode. And my main intention when I read the book was not to get lost in the weeds. And I noticed that when I read reviews, there are certain people who are absolutely obsessed. It's a bit like the Kennedy killing. It's one of the big assassinations of history. And there are people who are absolutely obsessed. And they immediately want to say, why haven't you discussed the ballistics? Why haven't you discussed line of fire, and eyewitness? And I sort of think, actually, I don't even really believe that kind of evidence is particularly reliable when you're in a situation where 30 years after the event, people are still being asked to give testimony, and where at the time it was a very, very fast-moving situation.
Right. Well, let's move on and talk about the opening scenes of Do Not Disturb, which I find extraordinarily cinematic. Can you describe the opening scenes and also talk about the murder victim, who he was?
Yeah, I'm glad you said it was cinematic, because I'm hoping one day someone in Hollywood will also cotton onto that, because it would just make such an obvious film. The whole book would make an obvious film. I mean, it's got assassination, it's got love, it's got sort of, honey pot, it's got spies.
Glamorous hotels.
It's got everything you want, really. Anyway, the protagonist and the person who I used him as my way into the story was Patrick Karagaya, who was the former head of external intelligence. And I had met him, I'm not sure exactly when, probably 1990s, in Kigali, when he was a member of the incoming rebel movement, the RPF, who were taking over the country. And at that stage, although he was head of external intelligence, he was almost like he was the press spokesman also for Kagame, because he liked hanging around journalists and he was good at sort of manipulating the narrative. And he was a kind of very cheeky, funny guy who liked to drink and just good company. And I sort of kept in touch with him over the years, very, very sporadically. And I remember he was always very free with his opinions, and that's not a good thing to be in Rwanda, especially, as Paul Kagame was tightening his grip on the country. But he got away with it because he had known Kagame for decades. They had been to school together. They had been young men together who were in the Ugandan rebel movement, the NRM, together. They had been part of this cabal of people who had set up the Rwandan Patriotic Front in secret in Uganda together. So he was kind of allowed to say things that no one else could say. But that wore off. And he began to criticize Paul Kagame, who started off as the Minister of Defense, but ended up being president. And this didn't go down too well. And he was increasingly vocal in his criticisms. He thought that Rwanda was going in the wrong direction and that Paul Kagame was not doing what he had been put in place to do. And eventually ended up being detained, arrested, ended up going to jail, charged of insurrection, insubordination, and then fled the country and fled to South Africa and set up an opposition group and denounced Paul Kagame as a dictator. And he was hanging out with some very important other Rwandans who'd fallen out with Paul Kagame and were living in exile, including General Kayumba Nyamwasa, the former head of the armed forces. So they knew who Kagame was, and they knew how Kagame dealt with dissent. And Kagame deals with dissent, even if it's expressed outside Rwandan frontiers, often by targeting the people who he regards as challengers, as rivals, targeting them for assassination. And they knew that. So they were taking precautions. They were being careful. The general had already been the target of an assassination attempt in which he'd ended up with a bullet in his back. And then someone had tried, while he'd been shot coming back home with his wife. He'd survived. He was in the clinic being treated. And then the gang tried to go to this South African clinic where he was being treated. And the idea was they were going to strangle him in his bed in the clinic.
Another really cinematic detail.
Yeah, just keep it very direct and very basic. So there was this group of high-profile exiles who had set up an opposition party in exile in South Africa. And what they were trying to do was to get other exiles from both the Tutsi elite and also the Hutu majority, many of whom had gone into exile, who'd been Habyarimana's key guys, get them to mount a multi-ethnic opposition movement. And Kagame really felt that was a real threat. So what happened is over New Year in 2013, 2014, a businessman friend, some playboy Rwandan businessman that Patrick had known for ages and who used to bring him news and gossip from Kigali, happened to be passing through Joburg and said, let's meet up. And he was on his own that year, and he ended up meeting him at the Michelangelo Hotel in South Africa, in Johannesburg. And at one stage must have made the mistake of going up into the hotel room with him. It's not clear why. And then he was jumped while he was in that hotel room by a squad, a death squad that had checked into the hotel down the corridor. They burst into the room and they strangled him. They closed the door and then they strangled him on the bed. And this was only discovered later on because his nephew, a man called David Batenga, was wondering, why isn't Patrick answering his phone? Why, he had rung him to wish him Happy New Year and there was no answer. And so eventually he went to the hotel where he knew that Patrick was supposed to be meeting this man called Apollo. He asked the staff to call. He was calling Patrick's phone. There was no answer. He eventually said, check the guest, and they refused to go into the room because there was a do not disturb sign hanging on the doorknob, and eventually David made such a fuss that the police went into the room and they found Patrick lying dead on the bed. And that, I just thought that was such a dramatic sort of an horrible incident that I wanted to use it as my way into the story, because it was extraordinary that this man had essentially been bumped off by his old mate, his friend, his trusted colleague on his orders. But it was also like the do not disturb sign was what allowed the killer squad to get away, to get to the airport and to fly out of the country. And it seemed to me it summed up the whole attitude of the West towards Rwanda, which is they've agreed their positions. They've agreed what they think about Paul Kagame and about the genocide and what happened and how the plane came down. And they don't want to have it disturbed. And they are not willing to listen to the idea that Paul Kagame is not some fantastic visionary leader, that what happened during the genocide is a lot sort of dirtier on both sides than has ever been admitted, and that in sort of blindly signing up for and supporting Rwanda, they are maybe making a bit of a mistake.
How did the South African authorities deal with the murder at that time? Obviously, you say the do not disturb sign allowed the killers to get away, but what did the South African authorities do after the body was discovered?
Well, it was very telling, because the thing is that the South Africans didn't want to have bad relations with Rwanda. They considered Rwanda to be a friendly nation, but Rwanda had already, by the time that murder took place, Rwanda had already been reaching out and targeting Rwandan exiles, high-profile exiles who were living in South Africa. And, for example, the general who I mentioned earlier was already under 24-hour-a-day armed guard, which was being paid for and organized by the South Africans because he was considered to be at such risk. So they knew what the Rwandans were doing. Relations between the two countries had really sort of taken a bit of a turning point. There'd been a souring of relations as a result. But this was all kept hush-hush. And then Patrick Karegeya is strangled in this really lurid style. And at the time, the public prosecutor said to the Karegeya family, we will find out who did this and they will be brought to justice. This won't just be another one of those sort of unsolved murders. But that's exactly what happened. It did become one of those unsolved murders, and they didn't even stage an inquest. And the family was saying, nothing has happened. We know you took all this evidence. We know you took blood samples. There was a lot of debate about whether or not Patrick Karegeya had been drugged. We know you took blood samples. We know that you have the CCTV from the hotel. We know you have the CCTV from when the killer squad came in. They flew in from Kigali and they flew out. And so you know who they are. You know what the names were on their passports. And you know who checked into the hotel. So it's pretty obvious who did it. The South African authorities were not even staging an inquest, let alone a murder trial. And what happened was that the family at a certain stage became desperate and turned to a group called AfriForum. And this was a very interesting move, because AfriForum actually has been in the news a lot recently, because it has been one of the key groups, NGOs, that has been drawing attention in South Africa to the spate of murders of white African farmers.
Which the Trump administration has taken up as a so-called white genocide.
Which the Trump has exaggerated, has shown all sorts of misleading evidence. But that's been a campaigning issue for AfriForum. And so in South Africa, they're regarded as a group that really has the interests of white people at heart. But the interesting thing was that at a certain point, they had recruited a man called Harry Nell, who was a former public prosecutor. His whole stance is, I am colorblind on the issue of justice, but what I can't help but see is that South Africa is not, pursuing certain cases. And in fact, he has pursued cases against people like Jacob Zuma's son, against Robert Mugabe's widow. He says, I'm colorblind when it comes to pursuing cases. And the thing that you can do in South Africa, which you can't do in most countries, is you can bring a private prosecution. And he knew how to do that because of his immense experience in the law, in South African law. And so he set about starting that process for the Kagame family. And at the very basic thing is he wanted an inquest. And so I went down there and covered the inquest. And it was really interesting because what became clear during the inquest, which it took 5 years to happen, was that the South African police, the hawks of this special elite, had actually briefed South Africa's government and had said, we can't pursue this case because it has political ramifications, i.e. we know it goes straight back to Kigali and straight back to Rwanda. So there had been a deliberate sort of foot dragging, let's just kick this one into the long grass. And AfriForum's prosecution made that impossible. And so at the end of that process, what happened is they didn't have a trial, they had an inquest, and the inquest officially found that Kagame had been murdered and that there were two likely suspects. The killer squad actually consisted of 4 men, but there were 2 who were most obviously implicated, one of them being the businessman friend. And so arrest warrants were issued for those 2 men. They have been sent to the Ministry of Justice in Kigali. And surprise, surprise, the Ministry of Justice has done absolutely nothing about them and has shown absolutely no interest in sending those people to face trial in South Africa. And it's been 6 years now since that happened. So it tells you how interested Rwanda is in seeing justice. This is a little detail that you may find interesting. If you go to the Wikipedia page for Patrick Kagame and look down for the inquest, you will see that supposedly it was struck from the rolls. And there is no mention on the Wikipedia entry of the fact that, yes, the first inquest was struck from the rolls thanks to AfriForum's private prosecution, but a new inquest was then instituted. And that inquest resulted in the finding that Patrick Kagame had been murdered, and the arrest warrants were issued for 2 Rwandan nationals who are living in Rwanda. And those arrest warrants have been sent to the Rwandan Ministry of Justice. There is no mention of that on the Wikipedia page. And, I think it's fairly obvious why, because it's the one and only time in history where the Rwandan government, which has a track record of sending killer squads to take out or attempt to take out possible rivals, possible political challengers to Paul Kagame, it's the first time that there was a real judicial finding as a result of what they had done. And so if you have a very efficient dictatorship, you make sure that those things get edited off Wikipedia.
You have your own Wikipedia editor in-house.
I have tried to get people. Editing Wikipedia isn't that easy to do, and that, your changes can then be recorrected unless you've got a sort of track record. And I have approached people and said, could you please change this entry on Wikipedia because it's deeply, deeply misleading. And I haven't yet managed. But if anyone watching this has a Wikipedia editor's profile and is willing to take this on, I can talk them through it and send them all the necessary proof of what I'm saying. It's all in my book, Do Not Disturb.
Well, that should be easy enough to do. The only rule with Wikipedia is that there must be a published source, a reputable published source. And you are an award-winning writer, so I guess that'll work.
Also, it was covered, not by many people. I couldn't help but notice how few people turned up for the inquest, but they were other journalists in the room, not just me. And it's now a matter of public record, but it's not on Wikipedia.
I mean, I suppose you can always get away with murder in Africa because much of the world just isn't looking and doesn't care.
Yeah, you definitely can. But I thought it was astonishing how few people showed an interest in the inquest into the assassination of the head of intelligence on the suspected orders of an African president, and how few people turned up to watch proceedings, given that it all took place, in a fairly, central part of Joburg. And it was quite clear to me why that was. It's because Rwanda is a dictatorship. They're very good at blacklisting journalists. And people wanted to be able to go to Rwanda to cover the future elections, to go and cover the upcoming Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting that was going to be staged in Kigali. Rwanda has recreated itself as a sort of conference center. And people knew that if they covered that trial, their names as journalists would be on the blacklist of people who probably wouldn't be able to get a visa to go back. So it was more than just a kind of general indifference. It was also people saying it's just not worth it.
It strikes me that Rwanda has done a really superb job of branding itself. I think you referred to this a little earlier in our chat. Can you explain that, how sort of the post-1994, recovery from genocide seems to have given a lot of credibility to Paul Kagame and his government, and has perhaps led Westerners being completely willing to ignore any evidence of subsequent human rights abuses?
Yeah, I think it's astonishing. Allegedly, I think it's one of these disputed quotes, but Goebbels apparently said, if you tell a lie and you tell it again and again and again, enough times, everyone will believe it. And I think that is what Rwanda has done. And it has peddled this vision of itself. And it's tapping into some very obvious echoes. I mean, we have another nation state which has played the Holocaust card, very successfully ever since World War II, and has played the guilt card and has branded itself and sort of got special dispensation in the way it's treated, in the form of Israel. And Rwanda very early on cottoned on to the fact that it could play the same game. Every single visitor who goes to Kigali is taken to the Genocide Memorial Center, where they see the history as presented by the RPF, which is heartrending. I mean, of course it's heartrending. Hundreds of thousands of people died in the most brutal circumstances. And they were children, and old people and women, and
to death with machetes mostly.
Often really basic methodology used, and piles and piles of rotting corpses in churches, because they gathered in churches which they thought would be safe places, and in sports stadiums. And, it was an absolute ghastly period of history. But this has been sort of weaponized and used because, what happened during that episode is the UN, which had peacekeepers in Kigali, pulled them out and then belatedly reinforced them and came back. But by then, most of the killing was over. And so Paul Kagame and his entourage are repeatedly playing the guilt card and saying, don't criticize us. Where were you when this happened? You abandoned us. You left us to die. And given that there's a large element of truth to that, that has had a massive impact. So I think for years that was the basis on which Rwanda got a special dispensation. Loads of films were made. Journalists were always very welcome. The RPF seemed to be, multi-ethnic, very open, progressive, democratic, all of those things. I mean, a lot of that was just nice froth on the surface of the water. And as the years have gone by, it's become quite clear just how skin deep it was. But it convinced a lot of people for a long time, including myself, I have to say. And then I think also what you see is this branding, this very, very modern, sussed, clever branding, which I don't necessarily think the Rwandans did this on their own. We know that they've signed repeated, very expensive contracts with Western PR companies in the States and in the UK and elsewhere. And so, they've used sports and sports washing to an extraordinary extent. The National Basketball Association, the World Cycling Championships, Arsenal, the fact that Arsenal players come out with T-shirts, saying visit Rwanda. Bayern Munich in Germany has the same thing. Paris Saint-Germain players do, also do this. And there's also a deal with a Spanish team I just heard recently. I haven't confirmed that. So, that's a young sort of politics, indifferent audience that Rwanda has tapped into. And you get these young, sexy players fly to Rwanda. They go and they get photographed next to Paul Kagame. There are these baptism ceremonies with baby gorillas, because that's, one of the things you find in the mountain gorillas of Rwanda. It's all terribly charming. And they come back having seen the memorial, the genocide memorial, and they're converted. And so are all their followers, and just recently the Rwandans keep playing these sort of sports watching games. So recently they've been bidding to get Formula One to stage their first African event in decades in Rwanda. I don't know if Formula One will go for it. But so you get this glossy, sympathetic, heart-rending story being propagated and backed up by young, sexy sportsmen and women.
Michela, isn't it also true that they have done quite a good job of managing the economy? Isn't that also one of the things that Rwanda has reputation, deserved or not, for?
Well, I mean, I went into this in quite some depth in my book because I wanted to sort of find out if that was true. And a lot of the statistics have been tweaked. So for example, for years they were saying that they'd had a green revolution and they doubled and tripled harvests. It turns out, in fact, agricultural production has completely stagnated. There were also similar claims being made for growth, GDP growth, poverty alleviation, massively exaggerated. And I've reached a point now where I don't believe the figures that I read. And it's not only with Rwanda. The same thing happened with Ethiopia, by the way. It's not that hard to do if you know how to do it. And Rwanda's economy, when you start to pick away at individual figures, you begin to think, actually, this doesn't add up. And yeah, there are these headline figures that you see if you do an internet search or any sort of Forbes write-up. And you just find that actually a lot of those key figures, they're impossible to justify. So I always take those claims with a massive pinch of salt. And I also think, what you see is Kigali has been turned into, it was always an appealing city because actually even under Habyarimana, it had had a huge amount of donor aid spent on it. So people forget, they think that Rwanda looks good because of Paul Kagame. Actually, it looked good even in the 1990s before Paul Kagame had even got there.
I think I had one of the finest meals of my life in Africa in the Novotel in Kigali in the 1990s.
Yeah, it was a donor darling under Habyarimana in the 70s and 80s. It was very popular with expatriates. But under Kagame, it's really been turned into this glossy kind of Potemkin village where everything, there are flower beds everywhere. There's not a sort of blade of grass out of place. Every curb is painted. There's not an item of rubbish on the streets. The Rwandan authorities also go into this habit, which the Eritreans do as well, of taking beggars and homeless people and sort of just taking them out of the city centre when there's a key conference and just taking them to a re-education camp, keep them out of the way.
Good old Chinese technique.
Yeah, exactly. So it looks really, really stunningly neat and tidy. And I think a lot of people they'll maybe go in for a very short holiday, go to the genocide memorial, visit the guerrillas, and that's it. Or maybe they'll just go for a conference. And so they come away stunned by this modern, apparently sophisticated African city. And what they don't see is behind it, the fact that Paul Kagame allegedly won 99.16% in the last elections, and that Rwanda's army is responsible for a rebel invasion of Congo that has already killed, in the last 4 months, killed between 7,000 and 9,000 people and caused city centers to be looted, and people, are on the move in Congo fleeing the rebels. And all of that, you don't notice that because you're in Kigali and you're just seeing high-rise buildings and neat flower beds.
Right, and very charming people.
Yeah.
Difference between the world you describe in your book on Eritrea, I Didn't Do It For You, and in Mobutu's Zaire of your book, In the Footsteps, is very different from the highly globalized world of Do Not Disturb, where African officials and their families travel between Joburg, Kigali, Dubai, Knoxville, Tennessee, London, Paris. Is that just a feature of development? I know when I was traveling a lot in Africa in the early 1990s, it was pre-internet. There just wasn't as much, air travel. Countries were just coming out of sort of Cold War polarization. But can you talk a little bit about...
Yeah, I went out and worked as a stringer in Kinshasa in 1994. And it did feel like you were sort of stepping out of the world in a way, because it was incredibly isolated. Very few airlines wanted to touch down in Kinshasa because there'd been 2 rounds of sort of mass looting of the city in the 1990s. And there were 2,000 people who had mobile phones. Zaire was one of the first places to use a mobile phone. And the reason they used it was because there was no other way of communicating, but it was only the elite who had the mobile phones, and they were immensely expensive. And they were called telecells, and they were the size of a brick, right? And because the landlines had all collapsed amongst every other sort of, infrastructural service. So yeah, you did feel like you had, I remember the fax. I was staying in a hotel. The fax didn't work. And I was sending my dispatches using a SAT telex, which was this sort of big box. And then there were the telecells, which if you tried to call abroad, it was $7 a minute. So you felt very, very cut off. So that feels like another era. And now you've got, mobile phone masts everywhere in Africa. And I can call people anywhere I want to in Africa. And that's been, and the same thing for those, the Cybernet Cafe made this sort of massively exciting arrival across Africa. How long ago now? 20 years ago. And that also changed everything. So the places were completely cut off now, are very, very hooked up. And it was really interesting. I went to Kinshasa a year and a half ago. It was so interesting to have that connectivity. But at the same time, you still felt the place had sort of fallen off the edge of the cliff in that poverty rates are just soaring and that there was a sort of tangible feeling of desperation. It's very tough to live in DRC now, and population has absolutely sort of exploded. So there are a lot of very frustrated young people who know that they need to do better and they need to be part of the modern world, and Congo's not giving them what they need. So I think the Congo I described in the footsteps of Mr. Kurtz has definitely massively changed. In Eritrea, I think it's a completely different story because I think that's an elite that has chosen to remain cut off. I mean, you had this very sophisticated, well-educated diaspora who went back to Eritrea after the liberation from Ethiopian rule in 1991. There was this independence referendum. Everyone voted to be independent. Isaias Afwerki, the former rebel, EPLF rebel, became the president. And then they got stuck, and it's one of the sort of now the most hardline dictatorships in Africa. And being cut off from the world suits the regime. So I gather that people get around it by having satellite dishes in their own houses, but they have made a virtue of remaining isolated. They don't want to have contact with the outside world because they're doing things their way, and their way means no elections, no constitution. They're very hostile to the usual NGOs that are sort of omnipresent in Africa.
An endless military service, right?
Military service for all the young people. For a long time, they've been in the stage of no peace, no war with neighboring Ethiopia. Then supposedly there was this peace deal signed with the new Ethiopian MP, Abiy Ahmed. But strangely enough, we're now again hearing talk of another war in the Horn of Africa between Eritrea, Ethiopia, which is once again saying wants access to the sea. So there's the possibility that there could be more conflict. So I think Eritrea wants to remain cut off from the world. That's a very deliberate choice. Kinshasa is trying to sort of connect in every way it can. So it's a very different story. And in Rwanda, of course, you did also have this very, very well-educated, very ambitious elite, Tutsi elite, that had grown up in exile because its members had been expelled from the country in the late 90s and early 60s by Habyarimana, who went back and they brought all their skills and their know-how and their desire to start again. But what they found is increasingly, as Kagame's dictatorship has become ever more obvious and ever more repressive, that they're now part of this really, really the surveillance state, basically. Rwanda is a country where if you go there, I think you're always very aware of being watched, monitored. People look over their shoulders. They're very careful not to sort of debate publicly what they think. You keep your thoughts to yourself, keep your opinions to yourself in Rwanda.
Does any of this remind you of Trump's America?
Yeah, I mean, I think Trump's America is staggering to many of us. We're all sort of watching, a gog and a gasp what's happening in America. But I do think, I think sometimes my books have been criticized because people have said, it's all about personalities and these larger than life figures. And I've always thought that's completely justified because as far as I can see it, the personality of the man who's running the show is immensely important. It's the key factor in every African country I've ever covered as a journalist or as a writer. And so I don't feel embarrassed about that. And in fact, when it comes to Rwanda, many of my Rwandan friends, there was the original military leader of the RPF was a guy called Fred Rugema, who I never met because he was killed long before I even set foot in Rwanda in mysterious circumstances. And he was young, charismatic, handsome, loved, adored by everyone, and very inclusive. And I remember once asking Patrick Kagame, the guy who was strangled in South Africa, I said, do you really think that if Fred had lived, Rwanda today would be a different place? Because the person who succeeded Fred was Paul Kagame, and who had a completely different type of personality. And he was sort of Fred's shadows, the quiet, silent, not very popular shadow when Fred was alive, who routinely got ignored and was rather disliked amongst all the other military commanders. And Patrick said to me, it would have changed everything if Fred had lived, if Fred had survived. In fact, Fred was killed on the second day of the RPF's invasion of Rwanda in 1990. Circumstances that are still unclear, and that's when Paul took over. Rwanda today is in Paul Kagame's image. And I think Rwanda, if Fred had lived, it would have been Fred Rugema soon. It would have been a very, very different place. I'm saying all this because I think the characteristics of the key guy, the big man, they really do mold the reality in which millions of people live. And you see that time and time again. And I think you're seeing that in America, where it seems that despite all these famous checks and balances that we all heard about for decades and decades, the whims of Trump are really changing everything about America internally and also about its relationship with the rest of the world. And you think it's extraordinary that one man's character, with all its failings, it's such obvious failings, can be so important. But that is the nature, it seems to me, of history, that character is destiny.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, I think in academic history, the so-called great man theory of history has been criticized a lot.
Yeah, it's very unpopular. You're supposed to talk about processes that produce, supposed big men. But, I mean, you can shift it around from that point of view. But the individual weird foibles of these guys often turn out to be really, really important.
Yeah. And we do appear to be living in a world where the great men have come back in a big way.
Yeah. And not only in America, obviously elsewhere in the world. But I think that's what's reassuring is, I think I've always seen that in Africa, the primordial importance of personality and character. But now we're seeing it elsewhere as well. We're seeing it everywhere.
On this, can we talk a little bit about Mobutu? Because when you were there and the times I was traveling there, he was on the money, the 5 million Zaire notes or whatever. His picture was everywhere. He was this grinning presence wherever you went. He had nicknames for himself in the fashion of Idi Amin.
Le Maréchal.
Tell me about Mobutu.
Yeah, the guide, the helmsman, all of those. And the hat, of course, which was a key part. And the shirts, actually. I was looking at some old footage, and the shirts of Mobutu were almost as sort of typical of him as Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela went in for these very colourful batik shirts, and Mobutu had a line, slightly more 1970s look going on with him. But I think it's interesting because when I went back to Kinshasa just recently, I saw that the country had softened towards him. And there's a kind of reassessment going on. So you were seeing young men wearing the abacos, and the abacos was this ridiculous sort of high-collared, stiff suit that Mobutu sort of ordered everyone to wear because he said that no one should wear a tie because the tie was a Western colonial construct. So for some reason it was better you had to wear a foulard and then no tie, and then, and then the abacos, which were usually in beige, sort of quite heavy beige wool as far as I could work out. And when I was in Kinshasa in 94, I mean, if you saw someone wearing an abacos, you knew that he was in the ruling party, and they'd almost be derided for wearing the abacos. But I saw young men wearing it with pride in Kinshasa. And there was an exhibition in the hotel where I was staying where they had, for the first time, since he was toppled, I suddenly was seeing pictures, paintings, very bright paintings of Mobutu. And they were displayed, in a way that made it clear this was not considered controversial. And there's a fantastic group, a pop group called NPR, which NPR was, of course, the ruling party in Zaire, but it's Mouvement Populaire, Musique pour la Révolution instead of Mouvement Populaire pour la Révolution. So they've used the acronym. And they're very funny when they perform. They tape their videos. They've all got these sort of fantastic sideburns down to here and pink flares and, afros. And they usually have a Mobutu double. There's an actor who's quite well known in Kinshasa who does the voice. He captures the voice and he wears the leopard skin hat. And so it was mocking, but also affectionate. And I thought, that it was impossible to imagine that happening when I was living there. And also what's happening now is there's a discussion taking place about bringing his body back because he fled the country in 1997, died quite soon afterwards in Morocco of prostate cancer. And now they're talking like he needs to be back home. And that's interesting because Patrice Lumumba, of course, the prime minister, the first elected prime minister of Congo, his tooth, which was all remained of him after he was assassinated by secessionists down south with the support of Belgium.
And the CIA, right?
Yeah, the CIA was definitely in favor of it. I don't know if they actually played a role, but they were definitely very happy it happened because it meant they didn't have to do it. Anyway, his tooth was brought back and was given a proper state funeral in Kinshasa. And so if Mobutu went back, it would be a similar kind of coming to terms with the past. I was in Morocco just recently researching another project, and I finally got to visit his tomb because he's buried in Mobutu's buried in the Christian cemetery in Rabat. And it's, by Mobutu standards, quite a modest tomb. It's sort of very black and white, which is quite...
No gold?
No, there wasn't any gold. It was black and white marble, and members of his entourage who've died in exile alongside him, one by one, they're all buried around him. Very neatly kept. But what I found really interesting is I took a photograph of me in front of the tomb and said, I finally found the tomb of the man I wrote my first book about. And it went viral on Twitter. It was obviously being passed around by Congolese Twitter followers who don't normally follow me. And I sort of thought, what does that tell you about what's happening in Congo now? And I think what it tells you is people are so upset, at the moment, a huge swathe of Congo is being occupied by this rebel movement, the M23, supported by Rwanda. They feel humiliated. It's the fifth time Rwanda has intervened in Congo and supported a rebel insurgency. They feel the West is turning, a blind eye to Congo's concerns. They feel they are disrespected abroad. They're bitter and angry about it. And I think for them, Mobutu is a national hero who may have destroyed the economy, may have become famous for his corruption, but he brought the nation together. He kept Congo together.
And there was much less violence during his rule than there's been ever since, right?
Yeah, well, it came and went. Because Mobutu put a lot of work into just holding the country together. That's why the Americans supported him, because it did look like it was going to completely fragment in the 60s. But, what they retain of him is he kept Congo in one piece. And they feel that the presidents who have succeeded him have either not been interested in doing that at all or have failed, because of Rwanda's constant insurgencies. So it's interesting to watch that reassessment taking place, and that the way in which there's more of a sort of sense of, there's a tendency to forget the awful things he did and his mishandling. The worst thing about him was that he bankrupted an incredibly rich, mineral-rich country, which is one of the poorest in the world.
Yeah. It's very easy to understand from the perspective of, the United States in 2025, where, last year, a lot of voters, I think, forgot what the first Trump administration was like and forgot the fact that the early weeks of COVID were, such a nightmare here. And there was some kind of, nostalgia.
Yeah, people have short memories. And if what came afterwards has been either not an improvement or actually worse, and I think a lot of Congolese would say what has happened since Mobutu left has been worse. Yeah, then they look back with very indulgent eyes and they forget the worst aspects of his rule.
Well, on that note, thank you so much, Michela. What a fascinating discussion. I feel as though we could go on for hours, and we haven't really even got that far into I Didn't Do It For You, and we've barely touched on In the Footsteps of Mr. Kurtz or, all the other interesting things that you've written about Africa. But thank you very much.
Well, it's been a pleasure.
The Rhyming Chaos podcast is produced by Maria Repnikova and me, Jeremy Goldkorn. The show is edited by Cadre Scripts. The theme music is Paperboy, composed and performed on the guzheng by Wu Fei. Our closing music is Eric Satie's Gymnopédie No. 1, arranged and performed by Wu Fei. Our cover art is by Li Yunfei. Please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Leave us a review, and if you like what we're doing, please take out a paid subscription at rhymingchaos.com, where you can also sign up for our newsletters. Thank you so much, Michela.
Thank you.